The Mexican Muralist movement's platform was based on painter and writer Gerardo Murillo's, known as Dr. Ottle's 1906 manifesto, which called for the development of a monumental public arts movement in Mexico, focusing on the lives and interests of the Mexican people. Unfortunately, Dr. Ottle's plans for public art were stifled in 1910 with the eruption of the almost decade-long Mexican Revolution. Mexicans revolted against the exploitation and poor treatment of workers and the great disparities between the classes brought on by President Porfirio Diaz's dictatorship. After the revolution, the new Mexican government sought to reunite and rebuild the country by promoting cultural pride and nationalism. Murals were a way of spreading their messages to a mostly illiterate population that traditional forms of advertising and pamphlets could not. Traditionally, the stories and ideas of Catholicism were first introduced to the Mexican people through narrative murals. This became the dominant form of art in Mexico and a ready-made platform for the new Mexican government to promote their propaganda. During the Mexican Muralist movement of 1920 to 1950, the government and authoritative bodies commissioned artists to create murals in public spaces. Communicating pride in cultural identity, historical traditions, progress of technology, and political propaganda were their goals. Jose Vasconcelos, the Minister of Education of Mexico, was largely responsible for awarding commissions to artists. In the beginning, artists had more freedom of their subjects and styles. Because of this, murals were inclined to reflect their artists' socialist and Marxist ideologies. Muralists painted directly on the walls of public spaces using painting materials inspired by traditional native Mexican wall painting. Their frescoes, encaustics, mosaics, and sculpture paintings followed the architecture of the buildings. As the movement progressed, the government took more control, and the works evolved to a favorable portrayal of the Industrial Revolution, the progress of technology, and capitalism. Murals were a gauge of current events in the country and solidified art as a valid form of communication outside of museums and galleries. Most participating Mexican muralists were political activists helping create a new national identity. They were formally trained and worked in urban areas. The artworks were for public enjoyment and not for sale. Murals worked to educate the Mexican people about Mexican history, the issues of the common man, and current events. Common themes included indigenous Mexican culture, aspects of the revolution, and social justice. Although many artists were commissioned during the movement, three artists particularly stood out for their influence and prominence. Their personalities, ideologies, and style span the spectrum of the movement. The big three artists of the Mexican Muralist movement, known as Los Tres Grandes, were Diego Rivera, Jose Clemente Orozco, and David Alfaro Sigueros. Murals brought exposure on a grander scale to the artists and made art accessible to all, not just the elite. Probably the most famous, Diego Rivera, 1886 to 1957, used traditional painting styles incorporating elements of Cubism to create works in both Mexico and the US. Rivera was known for his depictions of everyday life, portraits of important Mexican historical figures, and the promotion of Mexico's indigenous past. Rivera's first government-commissioned mural was "Creation" in 1922, which was painted on the wall of the National Preparatory Schools Auditorium in Mexico City. "Creation," featuring religious motifs with no political ideology, is an encaustic painting in which pigments were applied suspended in molten wax. Jose Clemente Orozco, 1883 to 1949, also painted dozens of murals at the National Preparatory School. His works focused on the struggle and lives of the working class, with an emphasis on human suffering and a fear of dependency on technology. Orozco was known for his distortion of the human figure and his open criticism of the Mexican Revolution and post-revolution government. His 1926 mural, "The Trench," painted at the National Preparatory School in Mexico City, depicts soldiers fighting in the War of the Revolution. David Alfaro Sigueros, 1896-1974, the most radical of the Big Three, dedicated his career to fostering change through public art. His radical political ideologies led to the destruction of several of his murals, his arrest in Mexico, and eventual exile. Sigueros' last ambitious work was designed as a cultural and political center, located in Mexico City. The March of Humanity, 1965-1971, is the largest mural in the world, spanning the interior and exterior of an entire building. Rivera, Orozco, and Sigueros all spent time in the United States creating murals on public buildings. Their influences on American public art inspired Roosevelt's Federal Art Project, in which artists depict scenes of American life on public buildings during the Great Depression. The Mexican Muralist movement was a predecessor to modern public art and the graffiti art scene. Mexican artists today still produce murals, and the art form can be found on public buildings throughout the country.